I've just returned from a week-long, my first solo backpacking trip to Hampi and Kishkindha, and this is the Kishkindha Ramayana, and this was the kingdom of Bali. This is where Ram met Hanuman, and you could argue that all these places, Kishkindha and Panchvati, have been retrofitted into the Ramayana at a much later time, and that those guys could not have known the history of or the geography of this country. But Sanjeev in his book Land of Seven Rivers argues that Valmiki's evocative description of Hampi, how he describes it and how the place is, there is no way Valmiki could not have known that place firsthand, or either through traders or having seen it himself. Further, there is a sloth bear sanctuary just 30 kilometers from Hampi, and you might recall Jamwant, Hanuman's sloth bear friend. So there are too many sort of coincidences, if you like, for this story to be retrofitted or made up and all of this, right? And Sanjeev also argues that Hanuman could have been a Neolithic tribe, part of a Neolithic tribe, which could have used the monkey or the langur as a totem. Right? And they need not be monkey-looking people. They could be forest dwellers, Van Nat. So, and LOSR, or Land of Seven Rivers, if I remember correctly, is dedicated to your kids, and you've written so that you may know where you came from.
Yeah.
And to be honest, that's the journey that this man sent me on, to find out and connect with the roots where I come from. And this was not the first trip. Last year I was in Cambodia, sitting on the footsteps of Angkor Thom, part of the Angkor Wat temples, and reading page 74 and reading about how Indian entrepreneurs, from India, from Bengal, traveled all over and spread the influence of very Indianized cultures, and spread Hindu Buddhist temples in Southeast Asia. So that's the effect of Sanjeev's storytelling on me. Sanjeev is the chief strategist,
was
the chief strategist and the managing director of Deutsche Bank, and he's one of the top economists in India. He's been involved in urban planning, yes, and one observation in one of his books is about India's inevitable urbanization. And in my last week, about 700-800 kilometers that I did in rickety Karnataka buses on small towns all over the place, starting with Hyderabad, actually in Telangana, from to Belgaum, I did not find any romantic, ideal villages. I found thriving urban centers, dusty, honky, bustling with people. I found markets which were selling everything from farm equipments to modern kirana stores, and at the same time rural sabzi markets all alongside. So from really a very idealistic Gandhian go back to villages kind of narrative, Sanjeev has offered, at least for me, a very powerful narrative of India's economic rise after 1,000 years of decline, which incidentally is his first book, and I relished it, unputdownable. So his powerful storytelling and his uncanny ability to connect events which are separated by several millennia is really what has given me a renewed sense of purpose. And this event is, to be honest, an expression of that sort of sense of purpose. It was I really had to say this and not make it a formal introduction, Sanjeev. So over to you.
Thank you, Rahul. Now I'll have to live up to it. Thank you very much. The topic of today is to what extent is Indian history really true? And the genesis of this really comes from a statement I often hear, particularly from educated people, that Indians are somehow an ahistorical people, i.e. that we do not we are sort of unique in the world and not caring about our past. That now this is a really astonishing accusation to make about what is arguably the world's oldest continuous civilization. Here are people who in normal conversation will throw up idioms and ideas and names and that appear in epics that are from the Iron Age. Every day, tens of millions of Hindus will chant the Gayatri Mantra, which was composed in a very ancient form of Vedic Sanskrit in the Bronze Age, depending on who you ask, between 3,500 and 5,000 years back. So clearly we are, if anything, a people obsessed with the past, obsessed with the continuity of our civilization, and it's something, it's a continuity that as we will discuss, we have bought with blood. So surely it is strange that we should be accused then of not having any interest in our history. If we were not interested, I wouldn't have been able to fill out this room at all. So what is the real problem? And I would argue the real problem is that intuitively we know that the history that we are taught, the history that is there in our textbooks, is actually false. And because we know intuitively that it is false, we tend not to have too much respect for it. So really, the issue really is, what extent is it false or by converse true? And the second question, of course, is then, how do we then begin to tell the story in the so-called correct way? Now, there are many reasons why our history has been mangled as it is presented to us today. And I will get into some of them, not all of them, because it will take way too long. But one of the very, very important reasons why our history is fundamentally flawed in the way it is presented to us is that it is not our history at all. It is really the history of foreign invaders. It is the history of the invaders writing the history of their invasions. And therefore, when you read Indian history, it is a long litany of battles that the Indians lost. So, think back to your history books that you have read or had to study at university or college or school, and it's about the three battles of Panipat. It's about the Battle of Plassey and the Battle of Buxar. But you never read anything about the battles that the Indians won. In fact, we won quite a lot of battles if you go back and dig up our history. For the very simple reason, we know that, for the very simple reason that we are still here. And we won this continuity of our civilization, as I pointed out, through spilling a lot of blood. And we won quite a lot of times. And that is why we continue to exist, because it was not as if those who invaded us did not try to forcibly change and dominate us. So let me name a few battles through history that many of you may have never heard of, but are actually major events in Indian history. Now you've all heard of Mahmud Ghazni and how he invaded India 17 times over 25 years. Now, if you read an Indian history book, you will get the impression that Mahmud Ghazni came, he invaded 17 times, a few years passed, and then Muhammad Ghori came in, he defeated Prithviraj Chauhan, and then the gates of India opened and we were conquered in one shot. In fact, nothing of that sort happened. There is a gap of 1.5 centuries between Mahmud Ghazni and Muhammad Ghori. Why is there a 150-year gap between the two? And the reason for that is that in 1033 AD, a very large Turkish army charged down from Afghanistan across the plains, across into the Gangetic plains, and was met by a much smaller army led by a bunch of local chieftains from that area, near what is now Faizabad, Ayodhya area. And they fought a big battle. And the Indian side was led by a chieftain called Suheldev or Sukhdev Pasi. And in that battle, the Turks were completely destroyed. They were destroyed and decimated to such an extent that they did not dare come back in for another 150 years. This army was led by Mahmud Ghazni's nephew, who was killed in that battle. There's still a mazar to him in Bahraich, This is the Battle of Bahraich in 1033 AD. Now, no Indian textbook will tell you about this. The only people who remember about this are the caste from which Suhail Dev Pasi came from, the Pasis themselves. But other than that, pretty much nobody else remembers this. But this is not the only example. If you don't happen to be Assamese, you're probably entirely ignorant about the fact that the Mughal Empire at its height was defeated by the Assamese in a place very close to Guwahati called Saraighat by a Ahom general called Lasit Borphukon. He's one of the great generals of Indian history. He managed somehow to coax the Mughals, who were basically cavalry and artillery guys, to fight a battle on the Brahmaputra, where obviously the Assamese had a huge advantage because they were locals. And he essentially sank the entire Mughal fleet on the Brahmaputra. It was a completely devastating defeat. The first really big defeat that the Mughals had faced in India since Humayun came back to rule Delhi. And it was absolutely devastating. After that, essentially the Mughal Empire began to fall apart. And you have, of course, the Marathas, the Bundelas and others who took over the Mughal Empire very, very quickly thereafter. Again, as I said, you probably, unless you are Assamese, have never heard of this Battle of Saraighat or of Lasit Borphukon. In fact, many of you may not even have heard of Bajirao till this movie Bajirao Mastani came through. And yet, he is one of the great generals of Indian history. The British did not conquer India from the Mughals, as our history books will give you, suggest to you. They actually conquered it from the Marathas, who for 75 years ruled over at least 2/3 of India. In fact, Baji Rao's son, Raghunath Rao, I think his name was, ruled over an empire that was larger than that of Akbar. And yet, he is simply not there in any of our history books. And then, of course, if you don't happen to be from Kerala, you've probably never heard of Martanda Varma. Now, Martanda Varma is an extremely interesting character. He was the ruler of what was then a very, very small kingdom called Travancore or Venad, which is he extended it, but when he came to power, it was essentially a principality smaller than what is now Delhi state. And he decided to take on what was then the biggest empire in the world, which was, oddly enough, forgotten now, the Dutch Empire. The Dutch were the most powerful maritime power in the early 18th century. They had already taken over what is now Indonesia, they had taken over Sri Lanka, and now they were attempting to take over India when they were confronted by this very tiny kingdom, the ruler called Martanda Varma, who defeated them in a battle in a place called Kolachal, which is just northwest of Kanyakumari. And if he hadn't defeated him, it's very likely that I would have been giving you this talk in Dutch. So, these are just a few of the very important characters in Indian history who are simply edited out of our history. Now, why is it the case? It is the case because, very simply, the foreign rulers who ruled over India for the last 800 years or so wrote history from their perspective, which is only naturally to be expected. They wrote history, but they consequently wrote about, one, they edited out the bits where they were being defeated, so consequently those bits were underplayed, but they also layered and layered upon it their own ideas and thoughts and so on. And the depth to which this has now percolated even into our own consciousness is quite amazing. Now, it is not unusual for a conqueror, particularly a conquering culture, not just a conquering individual, but a conquering culture, to promote everything that came before them as the age of darkness or the age of Jahaliya. It is very, very common. And so, this is a phenomena that we should be too surprised about. And this happened by conquerors in many, many parts of the world. So, for example, when the British or the Europeans colonized Africa, one of the common stated storylines that they promoted was that before they turned up, there was essentially no culture, civilization, or anything anywhere in Africa. Now, there was some inconvenient evidence that kept popping up. One of this evidence against their storyline was the ruins of an ancient city called Great Zimbabwe, after which the country was later named. Now, this is a fairly extensive area with a stone city that, the remains of which were found, they were known about from at least the 16th century, but certainly by the 18th century, people were well aware of this. And because it was very inconvenient to the story that everything pre-colonial was the age of darkness, the story was built up that this city was built by somebody from outside, perhaps from the Eastern Mediterranean, essentially white-skinned people who came and built these cities and provided civilization to the locals. And this storyline was the official storyline all the way to when the apartheid regime in Rhodesia, which later became Zimbabwe, became free. Now, people will immediately notice the parallels between this storyline and the Aryan invasion theory. Essentially, the British and the Europeans, when they came to India and they took over this place, they couldn't make the case that there was no civilization here, which is what they did in Africa. So they made up this other story that while we maybe knew, there were another bunch of white-skinned chaps who came and gave you civilization 1,500 years in 1,500 BC. And guess what? So you shouldn't really mind the fact that we have taken over your country, because really speaking, we are latter-day Aryans and we are here to give you a software update. So the odd thing about this is that it was done fairly blatantly. There is no evidence of any invasion in any text. The earliest Rigvedic texts have no knowledge of Central Asia. They're basically concerned with southern Haryana. There is no archaeological evidence of this. There is no genetic evidence of any invasion. And yet, what is quite amazing is that we have continued to perpetuate this storyline in our own history. Now, before I go any further, one thing I do want to clarify is that I am not making the case here that everything good in Indian civilization is somehow indigenous. It's not. We have been enormously enriched by all kinds of things brought from outside, by traders and migrants who came peacefully, and even by invaders who came in. I mean, the Portuguese may have done all kinds of bad things under the Inquisition, but frankly, Indian food would be entirely unrecognizable without tomato, chilies, and other things that the Portuguese brought. And the British may have done all kinds of bad things like the Bengal famine of 1943 and various other famines and invasion and massacres. But the fact is, I'm giving a talk to you in English. Many of you will go back home and watch cricket and so on. So the point is, it is also true that while these invasions happened, we have our civilization is a result of many of the influences that came from outside. So I am not making a case here, let me clear, to make a case that somehow, there's some pure indigenous culture that we must try and revive. That is not at all my intention. It is also not my intention that Indian history needs to be told from a purely the perspective of a Hindu India or even the Dharmic India. Because the fact is that we have many interactions. A large part of our civilization has been enriched by people who belong to faiths and ideas and cultures that have come from outside. But what I am making a case is that when we do talk about this multitudinous and very plural culture, we talk about it still from the perspective of the Indians, not the perspective of the invader. And let me explain how this would be. Let's take Islam, for example. Not many people realize that the second oldest mosque in the world is in India. It's the Cheruman Mosque in Kerala. It's about an hour and a half drive north of Kochi. This mosque was built by Arab traders who had been trading with India from 500-600 years earlier. So they were already very conversant with coming to India. And the very earliest Muslims, many of whom would have personally known the Prophet, came and built this mosque. This mosque was built while Muhammad was still in Medina. He had not yet conquered Mecca. Just think about it. This is how old that mosque is. Within that same area, with a short walk, are some very, very old Jewish synagogues. And in fact, Cochin even today has a shrinking but still existing Jewish community, which is the oldest continuous Jewish community in the world. Again, in the generally the same area, there are Syrian Christians who, depending on whether you believe St. Thomas came to India or not, it is quite certain whether you that this community is very, very old, which came here in at least by the 2nd century BC. So even if St. Thomas, that story is not true, they were certainly there from a very, very early stage. Many of their liturgy is written in Syriac, which is very close to the language in which Jesus Christ himself would have preached himself. So these are some of the oldest texts of Christianity. And now with the destruction of the Christian community in Iraq and Syria, I think one can make the fair case that they are now also the oldest continuous Christian community in the world. Now, this is just one state of Kerala. And even in fact, within that, this is just a few districts where this is true. So, the point I'm making is, they are also a part of our civilization, but yet our history books don't talk about them. They are much more interested in Alauddin Khilji and Babur and Ghazni. Because, as I pointed out to you, this is not about our history, it is about the history imposed on us from above. Now, having cursed this rather colonial imposition of history on us, the odd thing is that having become now free for some 70 odd years, we never went about cleansing it of these biases. Now, every other country faced these same problems. Now, if you go and read history books in any other part of the world, they tell their story from their perspective. And the reason for that is a very simple one. As long as the lions do not have their storytellers, history will always glorify the hunter. This is an African saying. And so, every culture tells the story from their perspective. Fair enough. The only people who have systematically not gone about doing this is essentially Indians. This is not due to a lack of our own interest in history, but as I will point out to you, it is because those who came to power in 1947 had a somewhat different agenda on what they were trying to do. And to make my case, I'm just going to take up one example of a king called Ashoka, who all of you have read about. I'm taking a very simple case, relatively, I could say, unlike Tipu Sultan or many of the others which are controversial. I'm going to take a case where pretty much every book, every historian, every TV series is very clear that he was a good guy. And I'm going to show you that in fact, almost everything that we know about him is actually a lie. Now, let's start with, what do we know about Ashoka? We know for sure that he was not the designated heir of that of the Mauryan Empire. His father Bindusara wanted somebody else to become his heir. It happened to be that when Bindusara was ill and he died, the crown prince was away in Gandhar fighting some invaders, possibly Greeks who were coming in, and he was not in the capital. So Ashoka basically happened to be in the capital, and he took control of the capital Pataliputra, and using Greek mercenaries, he murdered the crown prince when he came through to the gates of Pataliputra and possibly burnt him alive. Subsequent to this, Ashoka then actually massacred pretty much all the other male members of his family. The Buddhist texts say 99 brothers were killed, He also then carried out major massacres of pretty much all the other ministers, generals, etc., who may have opposed him. Now, having carried out all these great massacres, he left one person alive, which was his full brother Tissa, and every other male member of the family was essentially killed. Now, this bit is agreed upon by everybody. This bit is not the controversial bit. Now, it happened to be that the Mauryan kings, the Maurya family, was quite interesting in its religious beliefs. So the court, many of the court rituals that were done were possibly, very likely, continued to be of Vedic court rituals. But in their personal life, many of them had very eclectic tastes. So Chandragupta, who was the grandfather of Ashoka, possibly became a Jain monk in his later years. Bindusara was a proponent of a sect called the Ajivikas. The Ajivikas are no longer around. It's very likely they merged at some point with the Natha stream of Shaivism. But it was one of the big rivals of Jainism and Buddhism in the 3rd century BC. And of course, there were the Buddhists. Now, we know that there was a lot of contention inside the court, and it is very likely that Ashoka basically sided with the Buddhists for political reasons, because the rest of his family were either Jains or Ajivikas. So there was a political reason why he took on Buddhism. And interestingly, he became a Buddhist before, and I want to emphasize this, before he invaded Kalinga. Now, the conventional story is that at some point, several years after he had become the emperor, Ashoka invaded Kalinga. He massacred a lot of people, and then he felt very sorry about it, and he converted to Buddhism and became a pacifist. That's the storyline. But we know for sure, in fact, from inscriptions, that he was already a Buddhist when he invaded Kalinga. Moreover, having carried out these big massacres, we are told he felt very sorry about it, because he told us, how do we know this? Because he said so in his inscriptions. Now, it turns out, and I personally have looked into this by heading to Odisha and looking up his inscriptions in Odisha. It is very interesting. None of his inscriptions in Odisha make any apology for his invasion. Now, surely, if you were interested in apologizing to anybody and you were feeling so sad about his treatment of the Kalingans, the one bunch of people to whom he should be apologizing should be the Odia. But in Odisha, there is none. In fact, the place where his apology, so-called apology, is written is far away. Those inscriptions are now in Pakistan. Even worse, if you read through those inscriptions properly, instead of just the little bits that are put inside the textbooks, it gives you a very different picture. In the very same inscription where Ashoka apologizes, oh, I feel regret for having killed so many Kalingans, in the very same inscription, the very next paragraph makes the following statement. However, you forest tribes, do not think just because I am feeling some regret having killed all these Kalingans, do not think that I will not treat you in exactly the same way if you do not behave yourself. Now, if you read the whole thing, the impression you get is a completely different one. Basically, what he's saying is, look, I went and killed a whole bunch of those guys, feeling a little sorry about it, but you guys don't behave, you're going to get the same treatment. Do not take my word for this. Read that inscription yourself. It's available in various places online. I'm amazed that more people don't make a fuss about it. But this doesn't end here. Not only does his regret suspect, Ashoka then carried out a number of other massacres. There is at least 2 massacres that are clearly mentioned in a book called Ashoka Vadana, which is a Sri Lankan Buddhist text, which is widely used by the historians to write the history of Ashoka. There is one case in which he killed 18,000 Ajivikas in Bengal. And there is another case which is quite scary is in a modern context, is that there was a Jain who created a drawing of Buddha where he basically showed either a Buddha or a Buddhist bowing to a Jain Tirthankara. So his family was essentially locked up inside the house, including his whole family, kids and everybody, and set on fire. And then Ashoka said that he would provide a gold coin for every Jain person's head that could be brought to him. And this carried on till eventually the fanaticism went to such an extent that somebody mistook his last remaining brother, Tissa, and chopped off his head and brought his head. And that is when the madness stopped. Now, whenever I point this out to mainstream historians, they said, oh, this is not really true because, this was perhaps inserted into the story a couple of 100 years later by fanatical Sri Lankan Buddhists. So I said, that's entirely possible, but should you be thinking about this, should you not be also taking the same skepticism and applying it to the rest of the text that extols Ashoka for being such a great king? And in fact, the storyline that I have just laid out in front of you is based on exactly the same inscriptions and exactly the same texts that are used by mainstream historians, all of which incidentally are available online. Do not take my word for it. You can search this up all online. Now, of course, given the length of time and that has passed, it is entirely possible that my story is also just as weak as the one that is being taught in the mainstream, and I accept it. But the fact of the matter is, firstly, this whole story is based on very little evidence. Two, the evidence as it exists seems to support my story and not that of the mainstream. So, at the very least, why do not the mainstream historians mention that there is an alternative way of thinking about it? In fact, many books have recently been published, and there's even a serial now going on about Ashoka, which simply whitewash and do not even mention these great massacres of Ajivikas and Jains that Ashoka carried out. But there is even greater evidence of why Ashoka was not such a great chap. And that evidence is there in full display to anybody who bothers to visit Bhubaneswar. Just outside Bhubaneswar, there is a cave and a hill and a cave called Hathi Gumfa, where there is a inscription by a person called king called Kharavela. Kharavela was a Odia king who was a couple of generations after Ashoka. By this time, the empire of Ashoka had collapsed. Now, this is one important point here. Firstly, that Ashoka usurped an empire that existed and was functioning perfectly well. His empire collapsed while he was still alive. He was such a great king. Why did his kingdom collapse while he was still alive? And 2 generations later, Kalinga was actually free. And more interestingly is what Kharavela then says in his inscription. Kharavela says that I went to Pataliputra and I brought back the Jain idols that were taken away from us. I have then made the king of Pataliputra bend to me. What is he saying? He is saying, I have destroyed the Mauryan Empire. He doesn't have to say that these were the chaps who came and invaded us. And then he places this inscription in a very interesting place. He places them in Hathi Gumfa. Now, if you go on a clear day, and which doesn't have to happen the smog of Bhubaneswar, and you look across from Hathi Gumfa, across Bhubaneswar onto the other side, there is another hill. It's called Dhauli Hill. What does Dhauli Hill have? It has Ashoka's inscription. So, what is Kharavela saying? That you, Ashoka, you came here, you carried out this massacre. We remember. I went to Pataliputra and destroyed your empire. I brought back the Jain idols. And very, very interesting how he does this. So, the point is, the whole legend of Ashoka, both in terms of the texts that exist, as well as the behavior of subsequent rulers towards the Mauryans, clearly show that this whole Ashokan project was essentially a failure. If anything, it was the first large-scale act of religious genocide ever carried out in Indian history. and thankfully, this would not be too common for a long time. Of course, in medieval times we would have this, but at least in ancient times it would be an exception to Indian history. Now, I then began to dig into why on earth did we end up with this great story about Ashoka. It turns out that in the Indian tradition, Ashoka is not considered a great king. In fact, he was almost everything but forgotten in the Indian tradition, which is surely the best punishment that is possible to a king who wanted to perpetuate his myth. And he was rediscovered by the British in the 19th century by virtue of having figured out the Brahmi inscriptions that were left behind by Ashoka, because many people couldn't read it. So when they began to read those inscriptions, they suddenly discovered that there was this king somewhere out there. And Princip and others began to talk about this king, and then finally, after some effort, they figured out that it was this king called Ashoka who had put together these inscriptions. Now, in this context, it is quite interesting that it was the British who began to dig out the fact that even Ashoka existed. But his elevation to being the great is of even more recent origin. It goes back to no more than the 1920s and 1930s. And it turns out the reason that he was very useful is entirely related to the rise of Nehruvian socialism. You see, when you were in the 1920s and especially in the 1930s, it became pretty clear that in not too much time, India would become a free country. Now, at that time, consequently, the younger generation of leaders who were coming up wanted essentially to create a lineage for their ideological viewpoints. Now, there was a real problem if you happened to be Nehru or one of the socialists, because essentially the obvious place to look for a lineage for your thoughts was to look at the Arthashastra. Now, the Arthashastra is entirely inconvenient to anybody trying to promote socialism, because essentially, and by the way, those of you who think he was Machiavelli of India also haven't read the Arthashastra. Arthashastra has got nothing to do with Machiavelli at all. It is a text very well written about how to run an empire once you have created it. And it was created by a guy who actually created one of the world's greatest empires. So, unlike Machiavelli, who was a small-time political advisor, Chanakya was a guy who set up a serious empire. It is also not about spies and other things. Yes, there are some sections about internal security where spies and foreign policy and all that is there. But it also talks about municipal laws, it talks about taxation, it talks about all kinds of other issues that are related to how to run a kingdom. But the principles on which it is based is essentially what I would call a strong but limited state. What do I mean by a strong but limited state? So the Chanakyan state was essentially a state which concerned itself with the following activities: defense, internal security, infrastructure and municipal order, coinage, taxation, and some very broad big picture things. It was quite clearly not a welfarist state. In fact, there are many instances where Chanakya clearly goes out there and says that the state should not interfere in the lives of people, and one of them is very clear. It is a discussion on prohibition, where basically Chanakya makes the case that this is ridiculous, that others are talking about interfering in people's lives and enforcing a prohibition. So as long as people are not are enjoying themselves and not interfering with public order, we should never have prohibition. He actually says this. So it was very clearly about having a strong state. So in those areas where the state is paramount, Chanakya had no sense of humor. But he was also very clear that beyond those limited areas where the state was paramount, the state should not expand itself. So it was clearly not about interfering in people's lives. It's clearly not a welfarist state. Yes, the areas of intervention, yes, if there is a natural calamity, the state should intervene. But that is not welfarism in any meaningful sense. It's emergency rescue work. Now, when Nehru and the socialists found this as an inconvenient fact, they began to look through Indian history and look for somebody who fitted their worldview. And that is when they came across Ashoka's nice inscriptions. And in those inscriptions, Ashoka continuously talks about how to interfere with people's lives. In fact, he creates an entire cadre of people called the Dharma Mahamantas, what we today would call the religious police. And he instructs people that you shall not have a peacock on Monday, have a pigeon on Thursday, you will not do this. And in fact, he literally goes all the way to say that all these officials that we have created, they are like, I have created them in the same way that a parent gives his children to a nanny, in the same way I have given you these. He literally talks about a nanny state. So it is, of course, if you happen to be a Fabian socialist, think it's a wonderful idea. So you dig out this character, dust him off from history, quietly hide all the massacres he did, and then you present him Ashoka the Great. And essentially, this is the history of Ashoka. It's a completely fabricated story, pulled out of basically from oblivion by the British, who had other reasons to doing it. But having brought him out, it was really the Nehruvian socialists who then pushed him up to becoming this great king, because it essentially suited their story, and then they of course whitewashed everything around him. Now, I've spoken for quite some time right now, but the point I've been trying to make so far is that a very large part of our history that we read is actually bunkum. It's actually almost, even a interested enthusiast like me spends a little bit of time digging up stuff, will very quickly find that it is mostly nonsense. Now, this of course means that our history needs to be written. Whether professional historians do it or amateurs do it, I don't know, but it is the case that we now need to get on with the job of digging up our own history, telling it from our own perspective. Because if we do not do this, the tragedy will be that it will be done for us by others, for their own agenda. So now the good news is that travel is much easier. Much of the material is now available either online or you can simply buy it off Amazon. So it is no longer so easy to simply fool everybody all the time. And so one of the things I am doing as my own agenda is to begin to actually dig up some of these things and begin to present it to people like you, and to show you that how ridiculous some of these assertions of our history books are. In fact, I have this point about Ashoka I actually wrote about 2 months ago in an article which I published and went viral on the net. Many of you may have actually read it, and it's quite amusing that the magazine that published it then went and contacted some of the leading authorities on Maurya in India and asked them to write a rebut. And on every single case, the response they got, he said, you know what he's saying is, it's a tricky issue. Now, when mainstream historians say that they cannot respond to complete undermining of everything they've written by saying that it's a tricky issue, it suggests to me that maybe I'm onto something. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm happy to answer Q&A. Thanks. Yes?
Good evening, sir. As you have told about how history has been written in our 1,000 years, how our invaders imposed their history on us. So currently in India, what happens is there are conflicting ideologies. So whatever government comes in power, whatever whosoever has the charge, so they try to write history from their own perspective.
Yes.
So there are 29 states. Every state can have their own type of history books. Yep. So some people are reading, one perspective, and the other people are reading other perspective. So it is, so it's not uniting India. Moreover, it's dividing India on the basis of how they perceive ideas. So don't you, how do you take it? Like how we can create a mainstream research, dispassionate research about true history?
One thing, let it be very clear that all history is written from some perspective. Now, all I'm arguing is that two things. One is that there is no particular reason why we should spend 70 years after independence, we should be reading history from a colonial perspective or the perspective of a certain dynasty, we should have an Indian perspective. It will still be a perspective, but it will at least be a perspective at least more broadly in sync with which is our story. Of course, that story will be from, you are saying that it should be entirely free of bias. Maybe not, but it will be our bias. Why is that a bad thing? It's not, number one. Number two, however, even if we do tell our own story from our perspective, it is very important that at least we make sure that we stick to the evidence. Now, one of the biggest problems of Indian history writing is that most people don't even bother with the evidence. And it's quite astonishing that in fact it comes across even more clearly in my new book that I'm writing on the Indian Ocean. I have actually discovered that most of the Indian historians essentially hang out in various talking shops in Delhi and have not visited most of the major sites that they are writing about. It is absolutely astonishing. I've talked about many of the places like Muziris, which is a major port in Kerala. I was amazed that I was one of the very, very few people who actually goes and visits many of these sites. Similarly, when I talked about Kharavela and other things, there is actually the place where the Ashoka attacked the capital of Kalinga, which was called Toshali, and completely destroyed it. The excavations have found Tosali. And I went to the place to do a few years ago to look up that site. And the archaeologist told me that I am the first person who can be termed a historian to have visited that place. Just think about it. This is one of the most important events in Indian history, and nobody has bothered to look into it. But there are many such instances. I mean, as an amateur, I have gone around to many, many places, and I've been stunned that when you read the textbook, it makes no sense. But when you go and read the original source, whoever it is, and you read it and you just visit the place, a completely different story comes up. And the reason this is happening is that nobody is bothering to look at the evidence. And it is not just, and the reason people are getting away with it is because even those who are questioning these mainstream historians are also themselves not bothering to do it. So we have this entire debate which is going on in a vacuum without any evidence. So very important, before we get into anything else, that we look at the hard evidence, we present it clearly. It is okay to have a perspective, it's okay to have your own interpretation. But the facts must be placed as they are. And that is, I think, very important. But as I mentioned, sure, any perspective will have a certain bias, so what? But it will be our bias.
So I had a few questions.
Yes.
The first I want to ask you is to define what textbooks you're talking about, because I am a history student. I study in Delhi University, and more or less the information that you gave out on Ashoka, it is available. There is a book by Upinder Singh. I hope you've read it.
Yes. That's the standard textbook.
Yeah, that's the standard textbook. That's the most, it's the book that gives out on the surface, and it has a lot of information that you...
Yes, so now let me tell you, first of all, most of the history people read, you are a history MA student or maybe, right? Most of the people who will read history is going to basically get it from their school textbooks. The school textbooks, which is 99% of what is learned about, say, Ashoka, does not contain all of this, number one, right? Why not? Why give completely the false view, number one. Number two, even when you're talking about, you have a book written very recently by Nayanjot Lahiri on Ashoka. She does not at all bring any of this out. Incidentally, she does not get into Ashoka Vadana at all. I have read this book, I have it with me. I haven't brought it here. But she does not bring it out. Why? I would be at least have some respect if she talked about it and say, okay, I have this view on the matter, it's just fine. But to have used the Ashoka Vadana and then to have left out the critical bits where Ashoka is clearly shown to be a tyrant is just astonishing. And my point is, look, I am not saying that maybe many of the things I mentioned are later insertions, but so it's in the same text. Why not take your same skepticism to the whole text?
Second was, what is the Indian perspective that you think that should be added? And
It is whatever we write. We are Indians, we shall write it, no?
no, because as a history student, we get to read about a lot of schools
Yeah,
in history.
that's fine.
We get to read the Marxist school.
Yes.
We get to read the Orientalist school. We get to read a lot of schools because even if you're talking about the British school,
Yes.
there were paternalists, there were Orientalists,
Yes.
and there were people like Metcalfe, and there were people like Monroe, and they all wrote about it. And you can't really say that there is one body of text, which is the British school.
No, of course I'm simplifying for work purposes, I'm aware of that.
And just like that, just as it was in the British, you can't really say because we get to read a lot of history books right now.
Yes.
And on the same issue, we have differing opinions, and that will always be. Because
No, that's fine, that's fair enough.
always going
Yes.
to be different.
So my objection largely is to twofold. One is that the evidence is very often simply ignored or hidden, which is actually a lie. So I have no problem with interpretation, but first point is that a lot of the evidence is deliberately, and I gave you the example of Ashoka. There's just one example, I can give you lots more. Till recently, till people dug up stuff on Tipu Sultan, I mean, he was being turned up as a national hero. So clearly there is one problem with evidence, which is simply systematically presented to preserve. Yeah, archaeology, texts, whatever it is. Yeah, so it can be text also, whatever it is. Whatever the evidence is, it can be genetics also. Whatever the evidence is, the hard evidence has to be presented. If you're an honest historian, you should present then you can interpret what you want. So the first problem is simply that there's a great amount of dishonesty in not presenting the evidence. The second point of the matter is, yes, there are different schools of thought even within the Marxists and so on. But you see, what has happened and systematically happened, and you will appreciate this, that a few schools of thought have definitely heavily dominated the discussion. You cannot deny that, number one. Number two, there are many layers of things that are embedded into our history which we simply accept without really getting discussions about. Much of it is simple. Yeah, we do not, and I just gave you the example. Our interaction with Islam is always presented as great invasion. Why not about trade? Why is there not greater discussion of Indian influence on Southeast Asia, but in fact also huge amount of Southeast Asian influence on India? There is a lot of evidence of this. I live in Southeast Asia, there's evidence everywhere, but no history book talks about it.
What level of history books are we talking about?
The first point I made was about school level textbooks, which I said essentially do not even get into this, right? They basically given
Level physics textbooks similarly don't get into.
no, maybe they don't. No, maybe they don't, but they do not start up by saying, you know, we will now talk about the sun going around the earth, and then we will move on to the earth going around the sun. Right? So they do not have actual lies embedded there. They may not tell you the full extent of the facts, but they do not have embedded lies there. The point I'm making about the Indian textbooks are that the school textbooks have embedded lies in them. Yes.
One of the reasons cited by these eminent historians is that if they are being presented a true fact, there will be some unrest socially and politically. That is the reason they have, and I have actually heard this in one of the history congress last year. This might create some kind of unrest in public in general.
No, why not just present the facts? What is the problem with presenting the facts? They are the facts. Otherwise, let's say that's not a history. It is basically some. So the point I'm making is interpretation is one thing. At least let's start with being honest about the facts.
Especially with the Arab invasion.
No, of course there was an invasion. It's basically clearly obvious. Now you're never going to have. You see, in every country, before you have peace, you have, even for example, you take other multicultural societies like South Africa, which happened very recently. Went through apartheid and became non-apartheid. They had something called the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and they went through a whole process of truth telling. Everybody after the end of it say, this is what happened. Let's be frank, this is what happened. So unless you are at least honest about your own past, then why are we even bothering with it? Then let us not complain that Indians are not interested in the history, because at the end of it we know Even if we do not know it, I cannot articulate it, the average person knows that this is a lie. And consequently, they don't care about it.
And another acquisition, most of the time, is you are going to add Hindutva history on all other people.
What do you mean? My point is, let us have an honest discussion about what the facts are. And different people, you can have a Hindutva history as well. You can have a Marxist history. How is a Hindutva history, first of all, any worse than a Marxist history or any other? Everybody has right to opinion. They do not have a right to their facts. So, at the very least, the facts need to be told clearly. After that, different people can have their opinions. And I think let 1,000 different opinions flourish. It's okay.
Personally, from what I've seen, usually, it's not a question on the facts that creates these differences.
Well, actually it is. Now, some of it is pure lies. I just gave you the example of.
There was, Babur came to India in 1526, he conquered India and he became whatever he became. And the Mughals became whatever they became. Why did he do that? It has been presented in various manners.
No, but he's very clearly, this is the point I'm making, why he did it. Let's take why he did it. In the Babarnama, he clearly tells us why he did it. He says that I invaded India because it's a horrible place, but it has plenty of gold. Why there should be a debate about this matter?
Why shouldn't there be a debate?
Why? Because the man himself is telling us why he did it.
Abul Fazl writes this on behalf of Akbar.
Is it not on behalf? Babur is writing on behalf of himself.
Yeah, sure. Abul Fazl writes it only after Akbar signs it off. But Akbar only tells us that all the nice things that he's done for the empire.
Of course he does.
Badauni tells us about what he didn't do good, right?
Okay.
And then we take both of them together and we make our own analysis.
So fine. So some places they are separate facts. Some places they are separate facts.
So Babur can tell about himself. Okay, I came because of this. And we believe him only because he's saying the
I have a
right
counter argument. Just yesterday, there is a radio show. There's a radio show which talks about, I don't know what the show is called, but I was driving around going cycling with my son, and the show said it was on Babur and Humayun. And it was an invasion of Humayun on Ibrahim Lodi, am I correct?
Yeah. Babur on Ibrahim.
So, and Babur says, हम इन विदेशियों को खदेड़ देंगे दिल्ली से. I was like, okay, then what does Babur?
Do you think Babur said that?
That is the radio show.
That's what I'm telling you. What has now percolated through to popular culture, partly because the fact that you think that this is a matter of debate. It is not a matter of debate why Babur invaded India. It is totally not, because there is no other evidence of any other reason he came to India. If there was another bunch of facts and this was this bunch of facts, we can have a debate. But on Babur, as I pointed out to you, why should there be a debate? There is only one bunch of facts told to us from the best possible source, which is the man himself, who wrote that book himself, and he tells us why he did it. Why is this? If this is not a fact, then nothing else is a fact. Yes?
You talked about Ashoka. So when you're talking about Ashoka, all the inscriptions he wrote, those inscriptions were written by him or dictated by him, right? And there also, as you pointed out, that the people who wanted to propagate what Ashoka did only picked up those part of the inscriptions which were meaningful to them.
Yes. They edited out large parts of it.
Right. So on the same way, why has nobody talked about Baburnama?
Yeah, of course, it's his point of view.
Yeah, because it did not make sense to talk about them as per their own agenda.
Yeah.
So as per my agenda, I want to highlight what good things that Ashoka did. So I pick up those part of Ashoka's inscriptions.
Yes.
But as per my agenda, it does not
So
make
this is
sense
the
to
exactly.
talk about Babur.
So this is the point I'm making. It is okay to have any opinion, but you have no right to your own facts.
Correct.
You have right to your own opinion only, but you cannot change the facts. So the first point and most important point I want to make is that at least let us be honest about the facts as best we know it. Secondly, yes, you can have interpretations. Let us be clear that everything in the textbook is an interpretation, and there are different interpretations. Let all those interpretations be put in there. So when, for example, there is a discussion these days about revision of textbooks, and people will say that, it will be used as a excuse to introduce right-wing lies into the text. Now my view would be that is no excuse for leaving left-wing and colonial lies in the text, right? So my view is the only way you can deal with this problem is the following way. First of all, clearly state what are your sources and what are the facts, okay? Once you have stated what the clear facts are, then you say that these above facts can be interpreted to tell this story, this story, this story. At least give some. Now this will have two interesting impacts. One is it will be more honest, first of all. Secondly, our history books will become vastly more interesting, because rather than it becoming about a series of random dates, it will be about the exploring of our past. So I think that is a point I made in some time ago in a Mint article, where I basically said, let's put the facts down as best we know them, and let there be different opinions, let there be also a right-wing view, ठीक है? And you tell people, ये इसका opinion है, इसका opinion है.
So what is actually happening is, because the facts are not being brought out, so today if I say that Babur said this in his Baburnama, that is not projected as a fact.
Yes.
If I say this, it is projected as a right-wing lie.
Yes, so that is where my objection lies.
Exactly.
Yes, sorry. Abhinav, here you stand up and.
You see, India has been a culture which has very strong oral tradition.
Yes.
Especially when we come down to the subaltern history.
Yes.
This history has never been studied.
Yes.
It has been dismissed as a myth making or something. Up until now, in the last 10 years, we see lots of people are studying history from the left, but they are saying this is an attempt at Sanskritization. The example of Raja Suheldev is being dismissed as an attempt at Sanskritization, but at the same time they say they go and write a book, the Warrior Saint. The Shahid Amin wrote a book, Warrior Saint, on the Sayyid Salar Masood. So how do you think that we can deal with oral history in India?
So I think oral histories are really important. As I said, because we were ruled, much of the mainstream history is the history of foreign invaders, written by foreign invaders. So to the extent that our own history exists at all is actually in these oral histories. And in fact, this Raja Suheldev story, actually I know most about it from you. And how did you know about it? Because this is the oral history of the Parsis, right? So I think there's a great case for writing it. I am just sad that not enough people are taking this seriously enough. And to the extent that I know this history,
Very seriously, but they are going about undermining.
Yes.
Either as a myth making in the Ambedkarite mode or as a Sanskritization.
Yeah, so the point of the matter is there's no point in arguing against it. You have to provide the alternative, what you think is the, first of all, put down what the facts of the story as best known are, and then try and provide your interpretation of it. They can interpret their way, another interpretation of it, that's fine. Let a million interpretations exist.
Is the Indian history too hung up on Delhi and Mughal emperors?
Yes, they are, because you see, because the control of Delhi is where it's again it is again a lot to do with the history of who controls. So basically it was the history of those who controlled the Delhi Sultanate, and that is the perspective of it was hidden. So now when the British came in, they did not want to encourage the new history from the perspective of the locals, because they would much rather see themselves as, the Indians always keep losing all these wars. They are basically a slave people, and we are just replacing the previous bad lot of rulers with us who are a good lot of rulers. But guess what? You guys cannot be rulers. And so then you have a British history which maybe initially moves to Calcutta, but it's still it's a central history. It's the history of a centralized, and consequently we therefore systematically delete out of it these histories of the extremes, and particularly histories of things that could be construed as resistance. So that is why Lachit Barphukon or the Vijayanagar Empire or Travancore, or for that matter the history of Mewar, are systematically not presented into this storyline. Hence the Maratha Empire is a very inconvenient to the whole narrative.
I would like to add Chola Empire.
Cholas? Yes.
The fact that the Chola Empire was so vast in day that people did go to places like Indonesia and Southeast Asia.
And
today,
No, and by the way, incidentally, the Cholas were very late in the game. They were.
Hardly any mention of it.
Yes, and in fact, my next book, which is a history of the Indian Ocean, is a lot about the Odiyas, who in fact went and took Indian. It was before the Tamils. It was the Odia who were the great merchants of the Eastern Indian Ocean. They went all over. They pioneered routes all over, all the way to Vietnam, and they colonized Sri Lanka. In fact, the majority population today of Sri Lanka is of Odia Bengali. The Sinhalese are of Odia Bengali origin because of these huge merchant ships that were coming from what is now the area between what is now Hooghly River, that is now in Bengal, going all the way to Chilika Lake. That entire zone was full of ports, and they were coming down and they were settling in Sri Lanka. And of course, the oral history, since we were talking about earlier, it's amazing how interesting it gels once you begin to break out of these the outside worldview and begin to look in our own traditions. So why do they, for example, the Sri Lankans call themselves the Sinhala, the lion people? Why do they call themselves? Because in their origin myth, a king called Vijaya, a prince called Vijaya came, and Vijaya came from a kingdom called Singhapura, and his grandfather was a lion who had married a human princess. Now it's quite interesting that the area generally from which they had come is also to this day a major area for Narasimha worship. Even today, if you go to Puri, when the Puri major festival happens, Jagannath festival, the prasad is even today first given to a temple dedicated to Narasimha, because that is the old core god of that area. And equally, you have of course Durga's lion, which also comes from that same area. So the veneration of the lion as a major symbol of that part of India, which is particularly interesting because it's tiger country and not lion country, is a very strong tradition, which these people then took to Sri Lanka and have kept it there. And it's quite interesting, the battle between the Sinhalese and the Tamils, and then these old totems come out. On one side is the lion, and of course on the other side you have the LTT tigers.
Hi,
Yes, sorry, there's a gentleman right at the back who has been, yeah.
My name is Abhimanyu Gupta, and I'm working with William Dalrymple, and I was like really amazed to listen whatever you said. The biggest thing that you said about the propaganda, basically. So the best example that we have is the most terrible movie that I've ever seen is 300, where they're actually showing that how the Greeks are actually superior to the Persians.
Yeah.
Because it is actually setting in that US propaganda that why Iranians are bad even now. They were bad 2000 years ago as well. And basically the whites are actually liberating the world from the tyrants.
No, but there is plenty of this, and I'll give you, we all watch Tarzan and Phantom comics. What is the story really about? So white guy essentially is required to look after all these natives. So basically what is the subliminal message? That don't mind us if we are just running the show in your country, because otherwise you guys can't really run the show. So this is subliminally done in many ways.
Yeah. So I was researching, and ever since we are born, the first the most important history that we read is the Egyptian history, and we always see the pharaohs as whites. But now it has come out that the pharaohs were always black and their slaves were whites.
Potentially, I don't know. I don't know about this particular history, but it's possible.
So, like you said about the oral history, even Homer's Odysseus, it was written 500 years after the Trojan War was over, and basically the Homer who has written the Trojan history is not actually the Homer who was there, who witnessed the Trojan War.
Entirely possible. Yeah. I don't know enough about this, but I can tell you that there is a lot of this even in Indian history. Just to give you an example, since I was talking about the Aryan invasion theory, the history was that they came in horses with iron weapons and they went through. It turns out that iron is an Indian invention, and the earliest place in the world where iron is systematically used is not even in northern India, it's actually in and around the Godavari belt. In fact, the oldest, recently they found 2200 BC iron inside Hyderabad University campus, They have discovered iron weapons and all kinds of iron things. 2000 to 2200 BC. These are the oldest systematic use of iron anywhere in the world. So far from being a technological advantage of chaps coming in from the Central Asia, this was a technological advantage the locals had over the foreigners. Not only that, 600 years after this, in about 1370 BC, we actually have a bunch of Vedic god worshipping people who conquer northern Iraq, a group called the Mitanni. And the Mitanni not only worship Vedic gods, they also incidentally introduce an Indian technology, iron. Now to say that these chaps came from Central Asia is ridiculous. There is no sign of use of Central Asia of either Vedic gods or of iron. In fact, it's not even clear that they were the first people to domesticate the horse, because they actually, some of the earliest signs of horse are actually also in India, Neolithic sites in and around Allahabad. So, you know, the fact of the matter is that this whole storyline is basically rubbish. Yeah, yeah.
I just want to point, I will make some small comment. Actually, I believe, what my belief has been, there's been a lot of debates going on in history. Rumila Thapar has been writing one book and another book on Ashoka and the Mauryas. And Nanjot Lahiri came out with a recent book on Ashoka. So there are a lot of debates, and what I believe is that lay people don't actually care. These books are there out there for debate, but actually the people, academics have a monopoly over this debate. Lay people don't actually are not bothered by this debate mostly. They do not go and read these books maybe. They are because they've been doing it for a long time.
No, you're right that ultimately specialists have a huge advantage in any field, not just in history. This will be true of physics and true of, and in fact, I forget who, a very famous scientist made the comment that all progress in science happens one funeral at a time. So just imagine that if this is true of science, which is supposedly as objective as it gets, then in subjective fields like history writing or many other fields as well, this is obviously going to be the case. All I am trying to do here is to point out that what is presented as fact to much of us is not the case. I know many people have suspected this for a while, but I am just taking a few instances and bringing this up as an issue, because I think it is very important for any civilization, particularly one of which we are very proud of, and most people here would say that we are very, very proud of our civilization. But let's be honest about it, not everything about it is great. I chose particularly Ashoka because it would get away from daily debates on religious identity and all that, which are of today. Ashoka is relatively more distant to it, and that's why I specifically chose Ashoka, because then I can, relative to other characters of human history, I can show you that even in this case, you can see how much of it is fudged. Now, I'm not saying that this is therefore, we should not read history. I think it is important to recognize its nature. After all, forget about events that happened 2,400 years ago. Even events that happened in last week are furiously debated in columns every day in the newspapers. So it's not that surprising that we have different views on what happened so long ago. So I am not therefore very squeamish about there being different interpretations. It's the nature of human beings. World would be a boring place if we all agreed on everything. So that is not what I am squeamish about. What I am squeamish about is two things. One is a blatant misuse of evidence. I think the evidence has to be clear, continuously updated. It's not a static evidence as well. We are continuously doing archaeology, finding new texts, doing genetics, climate science, which I can tell you will completely change many of the ways we think about the coastline of India that we see today is actually a relatively recent phenomena. This coastline is alive, it's continuously changing. Climate is continuously changing. We are having one of the warmest winters in history, but let me assure you there have been many episodes through history where this thing has happened. One of the great events of our history has been the drying up of the Saraswati River, which was a cataclysmic event. So climate history, all these pieces of information are continuously being updated. we need to be honest about what this information is and continuously upgrade it. So that's one evidence based. The second is that we must allow for a variety of interpretations to flourish as long as they are reasonably logical. It is fine. My objection mainly is to the monopolization of this narrative by a relatively small group of people for blatantly political objectives that have continued to happen till this day. Now, I made this big hoo-ha about Nehru. There are people here who may be great admirers of Nehru. That is perfectly fine. But I have made my case of why I think he did it. And by the way, it is not a completely outrageous statement about Nehru, because Nehru was a great history maker. He wrote history himself, but he also created his own aura in many ways. I mean, here is a man who awarded himself the Bharat Ratna. Here is a man who, while he was Prime Minister, instituted his own birthday as Children's Day. And then, so this is not a person who is not unaware of the processes that I am talking about. He is very well aware of this. So, therefore, when we deal with, and of course, 23rd, we may find out some more interesting things about him. So, wait till that. Although I'll be very surprised if the most juicy files still exist. I'll be very, very surprised. I think most of the Netaji files have already been sanitized long ago. But anyway, never mind. Yeah, I have a gentleman there right at the back. No, you didn't. Okay. Yes. So, lady here wants to say something.
To the comparison made between Machiavelli and Chanakya. You said that Chanakya speaks both about acquiring power and consolidation of power, whereas Machiavelli doesn't do that. But I think his book, The Prince, 3/4 of is definitely about acquiring power, but 1/4 of it also deals with consolidation of power.
But he's dealing, but you see, Machiavelli only deals with power. If you read the Arthashastra, it's not, there is obviously, as he's talking about the state, so it's a maintenance of power. Most of it is about maintenance of power, not about acquisition. Maintenance of power is an important underlying theme in it.
Yes,
but the thing about the book, it is a very different book. It talks about taxation, it talks about municipal issues, it talks about foreign policy. In that context, it also talks about power, which is very different from Machiavelli. He is not concerned about governance at all, whereas the Arthashastra is all about governance.
Yeah, that could have been for a lot of reasons, I feel, and
no, they may be different. So all I'm saying is that Machiavelli and Chanakya being equated is ridiculous, because obviously any book written on statecraft is about power, but they're totally different books written by totally different levels of people. One guy is a small-time advisor to a small kingdom in Italy. Here is the creator of one of the greatest empires in human history, not just in Indian history. And then the book is a much more sophisticated book about governance and all kinds of other things. Machiavelli is basically about court intrigue.
I'm from political science, and I find it quite ridiculous when Chanakya is referred to as the Indian Machiavelli.
Yeah.
It has always baffled me a lot.
Yeah, because
why should he be called
it's
Indian
like,
Machiavelli?
Yeah, it's like, exactly. So, it's like being... Kalidas and Shakespeare, at least they're at this thing level. But here, they are not even at the same level. It's like calling Tendulkar after some Ranji level player.
Another is that in Jharkhand, a lot of excavations are happening and a lot of things are being discovered. Monoliths have been discovered in past 1 year, but nothing of no sort of discussion is happening around that. Not even in the historical
Well, some of it, to be fair, is very young, so we don't know what it means. Yeah. But some of it is very interesting from a different perspective, which is one of the things that I've made earlier. Is the issue about iron. It is very clear now that iron was an Indian innovation, and the use of iron spread not only was it an Indian innovation, it is a central South Indian innovation, basically Jharkhand, Godavari, that kind of zone. Yeah, so which continuously fits interestingly with our own view of history, which is there in the epics. Now, if you look at the epics, I'm not looking at the historicity of the events themselves, but the general description of the world that I'm talking about, one, the geography, but also if you look at it, the very powerful kingdoms in the epics are not in the northwest as the Aryan invasion theory would let you suggest. Who are the great powerful empires of, say, the Mahabharata? It is Magad, Jarasandha's Magad. He is powerful enough to drive even Krishna away to go to Gujarat. Who is the powerful kingdom of he's in southern, the Rakshasas of Ravan. The Rakshasas are from central India. They incidentally, they are not from Sri Lanka. It was Kuber who went to Sri Lanka and set up an empire, and he shifted his capital there. They are basically Central Asian, Central Indians, and they are Bhargavas in fact. Even to this day, the Bhargavas of Madhya Pradesh consider Ravan to be one of their own. So they are Brahmins from Central India. So this is, it turns out to be a major area of activity, and it turns out that they had, their iron was clearly something that was heavily used in this part of the world, and it fits in with our own view of history. So even if the storyline is make-believe, it is, you know, even people who are writing epics are usually placing it in the context of their times. So the places they are talking about are real. Even today, modern fiction writers write about real places, and very often, consequently, through those writings, you can tell what the social context was. For example, it's quite clear that, you know, northeast India had a matrilineal system, even in ancient times. Those who have read about Ulupi or Chitrangada and so on. So many of these things are the social contexts can be discerned from the texts.
In fact, they have a goddess named Panthobi, and Panthobi, they say that since Hinduism came later to them, the Meitei community of Manipur, they say that we still celebrate Panthobi, and Panthobi, the way Panthobi dresses and the way she looks is quite similar to Durga. It's very
possible,
similar.
but
The
you
colors,
see,
the hair,
you
everything.
see, there's a lot of things going back and forth. Migrations, again, a point that I will make in my next book is that Indian history is written as if there is some sort of a pipeline from Central Asia that goes to North India, then goes to South India, and maybe a little bit goes to Southeast Asia. That is totally not how you see Indian history, particularly when you begin to take a maritime view of it. Okay, there were enormous migrations into India and in and out from the east. So many of the tribes of eastern and central eastern India are actually of Southeast Asian origin. I mean, I'm not just talking about the ones that now still look Oriental, like the Khasis and so on, but even the Santals, the language, the Munda languages are actually all related to Khmer, which is Cambodian. And not only that, we now have genetic proof that they are also migrants. So there were migrations happening through the east as well. It's not just, you know, it's and of course, southern Indians were going up. And as I pointed out, there were periods in the Iron Age where the southern Indians probably were the powerful kingdom. So rather than the Aryan invasion happening, it was southern India going up sometimes and coming down, mixing, all kinds of movements going on. Yes. So, yes. Okay, two more questions. One here and one gentleman right at the end who has.
So Sanjeev,
yes.
Firstly, I want to say that I really enjoyed reading your book, The Land of Seven Rivers. I also buy into your argument that, you know, the history around, the maritime history around the Indian Ocean has not been as well explored as it should have been. A large part of our history is more land-based. But at the same time, there are some things which come to mind. The first thing being that I never really walked out of school reading history there, feeling not proud about my country. I did come back and say that, you know, this is a great country. I did read about, you know, some of your ancestors, your great-granduncles as well. So that was one part. What you're trying to say here, and I'm just trying to understand what you're trying to say, is that popular history, or there is something wrong with popular history as it is understood by the common people. But are you also, in some ways, questioning academic history here, or history as it's taught in colleges and in, you know, graduate schools?
I'm certainly questioning our general impressions of history. I am questioning a lot of the textbook history that we generally read in, particularly in high school, because most of us will not become history students.
Sure.
So I am questioning, certainly questioning academic history at that level.
Okay.
And even and here I also do question a large part of what is taught even in universities, because, I will come to it, a lot of it is, while yes, somewhere in there you can find all of this, but the way the questions in the text, in the test papers are put up, the bits that are emphasized, it's all much more subtly done in a way that it ends up in a certain, only in one certain dhara.
So what you're essentially suggesting towards is some larger conspiracy here. And
In
here
a sense,
I would
yes.
say is that brings into question the entire study, the subject, everybody who's related to Indian history and the institution
Yes,
of Indian history.
it is the
and
fact.
that I find something which is
Well, you
deeply
will be amazed.
discomforting.
Yes, I'll tell you why. You will be amazed to the extent to which most of the history we today read is controlled by an extremely tiny group of people. And I will not go into the long debate on this because I want to finish this discussion. But it will not require you too much time to look into this to discover. In fact, it's a tiny cabal who systematically have kept out for almost 7 decades alternative views of history. In relatively recent times, people like Upinder, who are somewhat more open-minded, have brought in some of these facts. But really, Dr. Upinder Singh, if anything, is an exception to this rule. People like Nayanjot Lahiri, for example, I just gave the book on Ashoka. She's written a book on Ashoka using the Ashoka Vadana as one of the key texts in that, and simply does not mention many of the dubious things. I mean, I would have been at least thought that it was worth mentioning some of the facts that do not go along with a narrative.
But what you're here quoting is an anecdote to sort of color the entire.
No, of course, I'm just giving,
right?
I cannot give you whole statistics
Exactly.
of it, but there are plenty of this. I mean, and this is even worse when non-Indians, there are some history writing that are appalling. I mean, there's a book on Ashoka. I'm just sticking on Ashoka because otherwise we'll go into all kinds of different things. So, just on Ashoka, one person, this thing. There's a book written by a gentleman called Charles Allen. Okay, I don't know if anybody have read this book by Charles Allen on Ashoka. Now, it's quite interesting. 90% of that book has nothing to do with Ashoka. Most of the book is about how wonderful the Europeans were to have rediscovered a king who the Indians had forgotten. And essentially what he says, and it's quite patronizing and in fact almost racist, how he says that, you Indians don't know what is good for you and don't even know your history. It required us white chaps to come and tell you what it is. That is essentially what he says in that book. It's quite amazing that he gets away with it. I mean, if he had done an equivalent thing today in about black history in America, he would have been lynched. But please read this book to just understand how this historical narrative is simply told in this particular way.
Sure. One final question, and this is related to the issue that you raised about Fabian socialism and how it might have colored how we see Ashoka. But that might be the case. Okay, let me grant you as much. But what about the Aryan invasion theory? And there are reasons why the Aryan invasion theory was in vogue at certain points in time, and we can have differing views on that. But Bai would say, for example, Nehru and his cabal sort of propound the Aryan invasion theory when, while it might have been socialistic, it was also deeply nationalist. We were talking about a new country emerging at that point in time.
Yes. So what happened is that in exchange for not messing with existing history, because that was not their focus, they were trying to insert things that were of importance to them. So this was one, not important. Secondly, it is quite interesting, I began to look into this, is that they continued to perpetuate certain myths which were colonial era. For one of them being that the Indians never had a sense of being a country. Okay, now I have actually, Land of Seven Rivers brought this out very clearly. Indians for a very long time had a sense of being a civilizational nation. Maybe not quite a political nation, but a civilizational nation. We have had I'll just finish, let me finish this. Had a sense of this. Incidentally, this is true of many other countries, it's not unique to India. The Chinese have for a very long time had a sense of being a civilization. The Greeks fought with each other all the time, but they had a very clear sense of being a civilizational nation. And every time the Persians turned up, they united. So the fact is that we have also similarly had a sense of being a civilizational nation for a long time. Yet, this is actually systematically downplayed in our textbooks till very recently. And not only that, as a corollary to it, the idea that Hinduism, for example, is not a religion. Now, why get into this? Because it again serves a purpose. After all, if a nation has existed for thousands of years, you cannot have a father of the nation, particularly not one in 20th century. You cannot have the Chacha of the nation. You see, so it has got a lot to do with the politics of it by simply perpetuating a previous thing, because it continues to serve a certain purpose.
No, but there's a perfect example of what you say. Sorry to butt in, but how we choose also which white voice we want to hear. We want to hear Wendy Doniger, but we don't want to hear Diana Eck, who's the head of the...
Or Will Duran.
Or Will Duran. But even, Diana Eck is still living, practicing, and heads the Divinity Department of Theology at Howard, whose wonderful book, India, Sacred Geography, talks about how, and she uses the example of Simon Sharma there, on how through the footsteps of pilgrims, the boundaries of India and the borders of India, the landscape borders of India are perfectly depicted for thousands of years. But that's not, you will never hear anybody celebrating Diana Eck at all in India. But you will celebrate Wendy Doniger. And I'm only saying, I'm not saying Wendy Doniger is good or bad. I'm saying, and I'm actually adding to what Sanjeev is saying and absolutely agreeing with him, that's a political choice. On which voice you want to hear is basically a political choice. And that choices, I have no problems, or I don't think Sanjeev has a problem with anybody making that political choice, as long as we know that there are options.
You see, the state power and patronage has been used for a certain way. I'm just pointing out that there are other ways of thinking about the world. I think we need to really, in this, there's a lady who has been really raising, I'll then come to you. Okay, can we take both questions and I'll answer them and then we'll stop.
Hi. Okay, I would like to first say that I've been a history student in Delhi University nearly 30 years back. I am glad we had professors who told us what history you are learning is crap.
Excellent.
Okay? And we were told the correct history is this, but please write these answers to get marks.
Excellent. I am so happy.
Since then, waiting for people like you to appear and to challenge the history that we are reading. My daughter is a history student today, and she does not like Indian history. The way it is taught, the way what we are learning. She wants it to be, she prefers she prefers, the Greek history, the Roman history, the Egyptian history, because they are actually rooted in their culture and they tell the history the way it was by those people. So if I tell her today she's missed something, she's going to howl because she would have loved to be here and attend this session, because hopefully she will become a history student in the future.
Hopefully also a history writer, because we need somebody to write those new histories.
And yes, and she is interested in writing, so I really would have liked her to be here, but we will follow up on this because Rahul is a Mossa.
Okay, so I have a gentleman there.
I just wanted to ask one thing.
Yeah.
I'm saying you're doing amazing work, and I really applaud it from the core of my heart. I want to know what are the challenges you are facing here, because I'm sure you are.
I'll tell you the challenge. The main challenge I face is the fact that I do this for entertainment. I am an economist by profession. I also design cities, and I have 2 or 3 other things I do. This I happen to do on the side, and I don't have time. I fund everything I do, so I don't have the challenges others have, which is if you're an academic, you need grants and all that. I fund everything.
No, I'm talking in terms
No, I'll explain what my problem. No, so I have no problem with. No, it makes no difference. You see, what I have done is I bypass them. I write popular history. I sell many more books than all of them combined, and so it makes no difference to me at all. My problem is simply writing enough of it.
Right.
I don't need grants. I don't need anything. I simply don't have time to write the stuff I know. I'm writing a book which will come out in August. I've already written another one which will come out, but that's not history, that's something else, that's fiction. And I also am doing other professions. So my real problem is I need an army of young people like your daughter to take up some of these subjects. I can give them really interesting stuff, tell them where to find the material. I simply do not have mind space to write.
I'll get it to you.
Yeah, that's what I need. That's my main 99% of my problem. Yeah.
I'm an engineer by profession. So you did a good task of this, telling us that there has been exclusions in history. Some events has been excluded from this academics. And simultaneously you told that in the 1947, what we adopted was not an Indian perspective, that was some socialist perspective. My first question is why socialism cannot be an Indian perspective first?
Can be.
But you mentioned that was
my objection is to it being an exclusive view. After all, there are not all Indians are socialist, not all Indians believe in Nehru. So my problem essentially is the systematic use of state control and state patronage to essentially perpetuate a certain line of history that suited a certain political class. I am not saying that history books should now be changed and everything should now have the Sangh perspective of history or whatever it is. I am saying that be honest about the facts, and those facts incidentally keep evolving because we find out more things about it, and to tell people that given these facts, this is very likely, these are the 2 or 3 things that possibly happened. 1, it will make history a lot more interesting. 2, it will be a lot more honest. And I certainly do not think it should be allowed that you have a tiny cabal of people, propped up by state patronage, who can then tell us what to think about our past.
So, are you saying that state patronage will stop in the future?
At the very least, you need to have variety. Don't give patronage to like 3 people who happen to be, and many of those cases.
You are creating some more space to some other.
Let there be other different views. Let 1,000 flowers bloom.
One more thing you said that we are not able to get knowledge about the Mewads and correct history of Mewad. But still I feel proud of Mewad kingdom.
No, but I can assure you it's not because of your textbooks. It may be more likely because of Amar Chitra Katha.
No, I haven't read anything about Mewad other than my textbook.
No,
but still I feel proud of Mewad.
Yes, so therefore, the point I'm making is we have had to be, we have to have
I feel proud of Indian history also. Why so?
Because as I said, this other alternative histories have somehow survived because of other alternative ways. But the state was not trying very hard to push us in one direction.
But okay, one more thing. There are many people in the Ladosra in the South Delhi region who will tell anywhere who will go that this Qutub Minar was built by Prithviraj Chauhan. There are
Qutub Minar is not, it was built, but it was built on top of temples built by Prithviraj Chauhan. That's actually
there are many
a fact.
people are claiming that this was built by Prithviraj Chauhan. But when we try to finding this truth of history, definitely I will become less proud of Mewad kingdom.
Why?
Because there are, which kind of big war Maharana Pratap has won?
Why? Maharana Pratap was not famous for being a construction guy.
No, he is famous for his valor and bravery.
Yes, so it doesn't matter if he didn't build some temples, some tall towers. It was built by Qutubuddin Aibak. I don't think even the Marxists think he was a good chap.
And you told us a different thing that 90% of history we are reading is incorrect.
A very large proportion, 90 or not as a matter of opinion.
You can say that we are not reading a major part of history, but you should not say that we are reading incorrect history because it
a lot of part of it is, no. So the 2 points I made. One of them is that there are interpretations. We are not telling people of different interpretations. That is one part. I agree that people can have interpretations, but my first and most biggest objection is that the facts are wrong. I just gave you one example where I told you about Ashoka. I also mentioned about Aryan invasion much more in much shorter time. I can give you lots of evidence on it. But there are lots. I mean, you can go on and on and on. There are large parts of our history are actually blatant lies. I mean, for example, just to give you one example. So somebody did bring up my ancestors, so I shall bring them up myself now. Now, as it happened to be, there are many streams of people who fought for Indian independence. Now, it happens to be that the revolutionaries were a very important part of that history. Now, Bhagat Singh has certainly been dug up from this thing, but in fact, he was hardly the only person. There was a huge thing. There was something called the Gadar movement, which during the First World War almost succeeded in throwing the British out. And it came within 48 hours of that revolt happening that somebody squealed and the British suppressed it. But it was within 48 hours, a very short distance. There were several major insurrections through Indian history, ultimately ending with something, of course you have all heard of the INA and Netaji thanks to recent this thing, but then it ultimately culminated in something called the Great Naval Revolt in Bombay in 1946, in which 20,000 sailors, mainly in Bombay, but also in Karachi, Calcutta, and other places, basically went on strike. And they were not only that, they were in control of a large numbers of ships to the extent, and these were hard-earned. This is 1946. These guys are not random sailors who just joined. They fought the Second World War. They are experienced guys. They know how to control these ships. They have ammo. They could have taken over, in fact, Bombay. In fact, they effectively controlled Bombay for a couple of days. They were not given any political leadership, and then they laid down their arms. That's a different story why they did that. But the fact I'm telling you, that was, in my view, and in the view of many eminent British politicians of that time, including Attlee, who was the Prime Minister of Britain, the key factor why India got independence the following year. Because essentially, they were no longer in control of the British and Indian armed forces. And so, this is not taught to us anywhere in our texts. Far from that, the soldiers of the INA, when they came back, were never taken back into the Indian army. The sailors of the revolt of 1946 were thrown out. They were never taken back into the navy. Why? Because it did not serve a certain narrative.
Purpose. Yeah.
That's why.
And sir, one more thing. It may be something.
No, I really have to stop now. Yeah.
Americans claim that Khajuraho temples were built by them. Is it a fact or not? They claim that.
I don't know. Well, as I said, you have to provide. I'm willing to that perspective, but they have to provide evidence.
Okay, thank you. I thought you would throw some light. But we are.
Thank you.